Okay, good morning everybody. We're going to continue talking about Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom a little bit. There's a famous vart. We said Rabbeinu Gershom is called Rabbeinu Gershom Ar HaGoyla. We said that really Rashi is the one who gave him that title. Rashi calls him Ar HaGoyla. But there's a famous vart, everyone says it over. I got this sort of writing from the Astraf Tzegayin, but I'm sure he's not the first one to say it. That the reason why Rabbeinu Gershom is called Ar HaGoyla is because his two most famous takanas, and they're the ones we're going to talk to today, his two most famous haramas, was he made Cherem number one was that you're not allowed to be megarish your wife b'akarche. A person can't divorce his wife against her will. And Cherem number two that he made, that was like that dovetails together with it, was that a person's not allowed to marry more than one wife at the same time. And Klal Yisrael felt that that was like a mashal for Klal Yisrael's situation in Galus with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We were even in Rabbeinu Gershom's time, we were deep into Galus, 1,000 years into Galus. So Rabbeinu Gershom made one takana layuchel shalchel b'akarche. Hashem can't divorce us if we don't want to leave Him. And you can't take another wife. Hashem can't take a second nation instead of us. And because of that, it was called Ma'ar HaGoyla. Like He gave Klal Yisrael the strength to get through Galus, to get through their Galus. Now, l'chera, that's not actually how the name came, but it's like another taich in the name, and it's something that's a vakanta zach that everyone says. So today we're going to talk about those takanas. I thought it's a good thing to open with. Now, I want to start with the bio of a famous person whose life was altered by Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom. It's not such a known historical episode, but let's talk about him a little bit. One of the biggest go'inim in the last, 150 years, probably 200 years, is Reb Tzaddik. Reb Tzaddik HaKohen was a Polish goin. He was a Chassidish Rebbe, Lubliner Rebbe. He was one of the biggest go'inim. Reb Shrage Feivel Mendelovich used to say that the Reb Tzaddik HaKohen is the Beis Yosef of Chassidus. Meaning, just like the Beis Yosef touched everything and wrote an organized structure for everything in Halacha, the Reb Tzaddik wrote an organized structure for everything in Chassidus. Reb Tzaddik is an interesting story. Reb Tzaddik was known as the Kranike Ilui. He was a Litvische boy. He was born into a Litvische family. His father was a Litvische Rav in Poland. He was a big Ilui as a kid already. Everybody knew about him. Like he was a wunderkind as a kid. All the Gedolim were interested in him. The Gvirim were interested in him. They wanted him for a shidduch. Supposedly, Rabbi Tzgalchanan was once passing by Krennik, and he even asked to divert his path a little bit so that he could stop by and check out this Eloi in Krennik. When Reb Tzaddik was 8 or 9 years old. So Reb Tzaddik was like a Bakante Eloi, a Litvische, Talmud Chacham. He knew Shas and Poskim. By the time his Bar Mitzvah, he was already a Talmud Chacham, Shas and Poskim. As a young man, young meaning, 17, 18 years old, he was read a shidduch, and interesting the story of a shidduch. There was a gvir, whose name I don't recall the second, who had a friend who was passing by, bumped into Reb Tzaddik, and he thought that this Iluish kid would be a good shidduch for his friend, the gvir's daughter. So he goes to Reb Tzaddik and he says, Bucherl, Zog ma shtikl Torah. Reb Tzaddik starts telling him something, and he says, he makes with his head, no, it's can't zog him besser. So Reb Tzaddik thinks for a second, he's a teenager, he says, meinst du Taisvis in Chulin? And he said, and the guy says, no, that doesn't answer it fully. He says, meinst du Muki Yosef in Baba Kama? And the Tzaddik spun a whole shtickle Torah to answer questions that this guy didn't even really have. Eventually, this person was very impressed with the Tzaddik, and he tells his friend, I have a shidduch, he read the shidduch. Liyamim, the Tzaddik came back to the town as a young man, and he sees this Talmud Chacham, who we had met earlier, who he really enjoyed schmoozing with, and he goes over to him and he asks him Savakashi, he wants to start talking to him learning, and the guy tells him, Herzachayim, du allein kannst lernen. You yourself, you could learn. Me and you together, we could learn also. Me, myself, I'm not able to learn. This is what the guy told him. So it's like a cute story of Tzaddik's Iluyishkeit. He's a big Iluy. It's a big Iluy. Now, what happened is he got married to this wealthy girl in a small town in Poland, and this part of the story is very murky. It's hard to know what people's agenda was against him, what they didn't like, were they jealous, whatever the issue is. And people started a rumor in the town. His wife, Tzaddik's young wife, no children, his young wife, would work in her father's store, factory, whatever, her father's enterprise. And people started a rumor about her that she was, a tzalasta lady. They said she shook hands with the men, she used to schmooze with the men, and Tzaddik was obviously, very frum. And Tzaddik was very, very taken by this, and he said he made like a kinoi and a stira for her, and he said, I want to divorce her, I can't be married to her. Now she said, and it seems many people held like this as well, that this was a alilas shav, this never happened, and people were just jealous either of her father or of her or of him, and wanted to, mess up the shidduch. and it never happened, and she refused to accept the get from him. Now here we cross Cherem number 1 of Rabbeinu Tam. Yeah, of Rabbeinu Gershom. She didn't want to take a get from him. Now Rav Tzaddik knew that the only solution to this, if you want to give a get and the woman doesn't want to take it, is to get Hatamei Rabbanim, which we'll discuss, probably not today, but in the future, Hatamei Rabbanim, and he himself started traveling around Poland and Litva to collect signatures from Rabbanim. As we'll see, the conditions of Hatamei Rabbanim require you to get signatures from different areas, different Rabbanim, and Rav Tzaddik himself started traveling around to get signatures from many different Rabbanim in all over the area. Now there are many legendary stories of Rav Tzaddik's interactions with various Gedolim, because it's rare that a young Eloi who's 19 years old goes and spends quality time with all the Gedolim. Meaning it's a very rare coming out party. Most people don't have that. Most Gainim, when they're 19 years old, at least in those days, were sitting in a village somewhere in Litva or Poland or wherever it is, some Verstachta village, harving over learning 18 to 20 hours a day. Nobody heard about them until they were 30, 40, 50, whatever. That wasn't the norm. Tzaddik had this tour. He went to collect signatures and he met all the various Gedolim. There's a whole bunch of stories. And Tzaddik composed an 86-page tshuva to give the halachic basis for him needing a Hatamei Rabbanon. And everywhere he would go, he would present that tshuva to the gadol, and he would see what they had to say. Now, what's interesting is that many Gedolim gave him signatures. The end of the story was he didn't need it. She accepted again on her own. But many Gedolim were willing to give him signatures. But there was a few notable standouts who didn't want to give him signatures and warned him. Now, there's different versions of this, but probably Rav Chaim Tzanzer, the Divrei Chaim, and probably Aaron Chernobyl, or the Chernobyl Magid, both of them, each one in their own signon, told him that this is the wrong thing. Either Rav Chaim Tzanzer, they say, told him that I see Baruch HaKodesh that she's okay. She's not who you think she is. Aaron Chernobyl told him that Bisman is that we don't do kini and steerim, because of that it's a problem. A different Gedolei, Rebbes warned him not to do it. He didn't listen. He went through with it. And Liyamim, after he divorced her and married a second wife, he never had children. Tzaddik never had children. Tzaddik said the reason why he didn't have children, maybe Rav Chaim Tzanz even told him this, is because he didn't listen to these Gracie Rabbis, and he went through with this divorce, which was like a variation of Balkarcha, or a variation of violating Rabbeinu Gershom's Cherem, like by doing a Balkarcha. Now, there's another interesting side note over here, is that Rav Tzaddik, when he was visiting the Rav of Lublin, I think the Litvish Rav of Lublin, he bumped into Yingeman over there, an Einikl of Reb Kveger, another famous young genius, whose name was Rabbeinu Eger. Rabbeinu Eger was already becoming Hasidish, or was close to being Hasidish. Rabbeinu Eger is also a convert. He grew up in a very Litvish family. He grew up in Shlomo Eger's house. As a young adult, he became Hasidish. Rabbeinu Eger was already flirting with Hasidus there. He met Rabbeinu Eger. He was obviously taken by Rabbeinu Eger. He was a few years older than him. He was a blue-blooded Eloi from the Eger family. He was a big genius. And he met him, and then Liyamim, he heard that Rabbeinu Eger went to the Ishbitzer Rebbe. He said, if Azak Cup, like Rabbeinu Eger went to the Ishbitzer, there must be something there that's worth going for. And the Tzaddik himself went to the Ishbitzer, and later on they both became the Rebbes of Lublin, meaning when the Ishbitzer was Nifter, Rabbeinu Eger took over, and then after that, the Tzaddik took over. So this little tour throughout the area to collect signatures turned the Tzaddik, it gave him Tzaddik, he ended up getting the divorce, and it turned him into a Chassid, and then ultimately into a Rebbe. Now, Tzaddik Taka never had children his whole life. He wrote a sefer called Peiket HaKarim, one of his many svarim, which we held would be like a schus to have children. He still was not zeichet to any children. But he wrote like a whole collection of svarim, and anybody who's into Achshav or Chasidus, even Kabbalah knows who Tzaddik. Tzaddik is an iconic contributor in that field. Yirchi, I think he's a good opener to the discussion of these two charamas of Rabbeinu Gershom, of not to give a get al karchai and not to marry two wives. Now, there's an interesting thing we have to start with. Medina the Gemara in Yavamis brings a machlokes. Now, the Gemara in Yavamis brings a machlokes as follows. The Gemara says like this. The Gemara in Yavamis on Daf Samachay Amid Aleph says as follows. The Gemara says like this. Anybody who marries another wife while he's married to one wife, meaning he takes a second wife, should be moitzi and give a ksuva. Rabba says, a person could marry many wives while he's married, provided that he has enough money to take care of them. He has money to feed them. And as I pass in the Shulchan Aruch and Ibn Ezra and Siman Aleph and Sif Tes says as follows: a person could marry many wives, as long as he could give them what they need. This comes from the Gemara Ramos in another place. A person shouldn't marry more than 4 wives. In a place where the minig is not to marry more than 1 wife, there you're not allowed to marry more than 1 wife, and there's a shayla what the mechaber means over there. That's the din. That's gebrach in Shulchan Aruch. So we paskin that a person is allowed to marry more than 1 wife, although no one we know has married more than 1 wife in a very long time. But that's the halach in Shulchan Aruch that a person is allowed to marry more than 1 wife. Now the mechaber obviously is a Sephardi, and in the Sephardic world they did marry more than 1 wife up till very recently, and I think that'll be a follow-up share. We'll talk about how and when that went away. Now, what's interesting is Reuven Margolius, who's a famous Eloi, the mechaber of Margolius Hayam and many other svarim. Today they're putting out again a bunch of his different svarim, very, very nice stuff. In his Sefer Oilulus, he has a shtickle over there. Oilulus Siman Vav is a shtickle about Riboy Nashim, where he brings a bunch of rayas that L'daitoi, having more than 1 wife was never something people really did, which is a chiddush. I think when we think about it, the Gemara, the Gemara Yevamos is full of dinim of tzaras, right, of co-wives. The whole Masechta is busy with co-wives, tzaras, and all these different hechatemtzes and cases. Reuven Margolius brings many rayas, and I want to read you just a few of them, where he says, maybe it's a chiddush of his own, but he brings many rayas that it was never common to have many wives. And he starts off, he brings a psikta. He says, the psikta Rabbasi says as follows. It says, by Shmuel, in the beginning of Shmuel Aleph, it says, Vayhi ish echad min Ramasayim Tzayfim. There was a person from Ramasayim Tzayfim. Amr Rav Yochanan Mishum Rebbe. I don't know if it's a Rebbe, actually Rebbe Yehuda. Amr Yehuda Mishum Rebbe. Va'achar kol ha-shevach hazeh kasav by v'lo shtei nashim. After this whole shevach about how good Elkanah was, the father of Shmuel Hanavi, meaning that he was this important person from Masayim Tzayfim, then it says he married 2 wives. Lama natal shtei nashim, the Psikta asks, meaning if he's an Adam Chashiv, he's a great mensch, why is he marrying 2 wives? So the Psikta answers, B'shvil v'yihila pnina yeladim ulachane and yeladim. Kivin sheras achanish le'yolda amra, oimul l'chshichlus teras l'beisi. He thought this would be a method to have children. He was struggling to have children with his wife, and he thought this could be a method to have children. So says Reuven Margolius, you see from this Psikta, the Psikta seemed to neman for a pashtus, that a great mensch, an Adam Chashiv, wouldn't have had 2 wives. It has to be, there's some sort of special story why Shmuel's father had 2 wives. Then he continues on, he brings a medrash, a targum from Rus, Perak Dalet Pasuk Vav, that says as follows, the Goyal says, Le'ucha liguli, penashches es nachlasi. The targum teaches, Les ana yachal mifrik le, I can't marry Rus, al de isli itzisa, because I have a wife already. Les li lemesa v'chornisa, alei dilmatei lematza meriva bebesi. And I can't marry a second wife while I'm married to 1 wife, because maybe they'll end up fighting with each other. And then he brings the targum later on, says by Bayaz, actually the Gemara Babas says by Bayaz, that Mesa Ishlish Bayaz, Ishlish's wife died. So again he says, you see over there, in that case, that the Goyal, Pliny Almaini, was not able to do it because he was married to a wife, and Bayaz, whose wife had just died, was available to do this form of Yibum with Rus. So you see, he says that it wasn't popular. Then he continues on, he says, Gam betkufas Rabbeinu Chachmei HaMishnah v'Talmud, and he brings a whole bunch of Gemaras where Arayas, that it was uncommon to marry 2 wives. And he says, V'lei barak b'chol gedolei umma, not dafta by the gedolei Yisrael. He says, Kiyim gam b'chol hamoyne Yisrael, lehoyu matzah shetiyana lishtei nashim yachad, kasher noichach misugnan hamasupper, al chagigas bas Yisrael. Then he brings right, he says, even regular passionate people didn't have more than 1 wife. He says, I'll bring you as follows. He says, there's a famous Gemara and the Tainus that says that they would send the girls out to the fields to dance, and the men would come choose wives. And the advice that Chazal said was, they said, Misha ein lo isha nifna l'sham. Someone who doesn't have a wife should go look at the girls who are dancing and get a wife. Now he says, Mashra, someone who doesn't have, he brings all these different diukim. It's a few pages long. It's a classic of Reuven Margolius, full of Iluyishkeit and Kishrin. The thing itself is, I guess, Nishtahi Nishtahar, you don't have to agree with this diukim that he's having, but these are fascinating diukim that he says that the common minig, he says, was not to have 2 wives. This is the common minig. The Yichshia, the Shulchan Aruch, though, Paskins, based on the Gemara Nivamis, and the Rambam holds like this, that one is allowed to have 2 wives. That's the halacha. And certainly, although maybe he's saying is true, maybe these midrashim or these chazals, or maybe in the Ashkenazi world, but in the Sephardi world, this is factually incorrect. And there was definitely people who had more than 1 wife, especially like in the real Islamic countries where it was very common, they did have 1 wife. They did have more than 1 wife. Now, in any case, Rabbeinu Gershom, about 1,000 years ago, made a rule that countervening what it says in Shulchan Aruch, what it says in the Gemara Nivamis, that you're allowed to have 2 wives. So Rabbeinu Gershom says, made a cherem, that a person's not allowed to take 2 wives anymore. Now, the cherem is brought down, like we mentioned, in many of the Gedolei Ashkenaz, in the Kolbai, in the Machzavitri, in the Rami Rotenberg, the Mordechai discusses it, the Rav Yad discusses it. There's many. Rabbeinu Tam brought down in Taisus a few times. Rabbeinu Tam brings it. Meaning, there's many Makaris. Rashbam talks about it. All the Rishonim talk about Rabbeinu Gershom's cherem, And that means it was very, very widely accepted, like one in the Ashkenazi world. The Trumas Hadeshen brings that maybe not every single place, and we'll see the Shuvas Rashbas and Mariks, we'll try to get to all these things. But now, Rabbeinu Gershom made this takana, now why did he make this takana? Meaning, we know there is a takana. What's the reason for this takana? Meaning, Rabbeinu Gershom, where it's recorded, doesn't say a reason, it just says don't do it. A person shouldn't marry more than one wife. So, because Rabbeinu Gershom himself didn't give a reason, so obviously there's many, many more reasons, because everyone's coming up with their own, call it theories, let's say. Meaning, even though we're talking about Gedei Le'elam, meaning the Gedei Le'achronim, etc., coming up, but it's a theory, because Rabbeinu Gershom never said what it is, and because of that, Lamashal, just from the Ram Padva, who's from the Gedei Le'achronim, like right at the border between Rishon and Achronim 500 years ago, let's say, Ram Padva has, in two different chuvas, three different reasons spread out over two different chuvas. Meaning in one tshuva, in tshuva Yadal, he says one reason, in tshuva Ayin Vav, he says another reason, and the Shoyal says another reason, and he doesn't argue with it, he says Ulai. So meaning, like just for example, just the Rampadva has dispersed throughout his Svarim three different reasons. Meaning these are theories that they have. So I want to share some of them, and I want to say one of them that to me was striking, interesting. One of them will go backwards. Rabbi Yaakov Emden in Shelos Yavitz and Chelik Beis in Tshuva Tesvav, in a long tshuva about Pilagshim. Rabbi Yaakov Emden over there, he suggests that the whole thing not to have two wives was just because they lived in Christian countries and bigamy became usher about 1,000 years ago in Christian countries. That's when bigamy became disallowed. And how it looked he doesn't say how it looks. He says Jews lived under the auspices of these host nations, these Catholic host nations, where this was frowned upon and was considered highly illegal. As a matter of fact, one of the shining marks of Western civilization is that they disallowed bigamy, while the Eastern world, the Islamists, always allowed bigamy, even till now. I mean, that was like a big differentiation between the Eastern and the Western world. Jews, primarily Ashkenazi Jews, lived in the Western world, and it would be very frowned upon if Jews were doing bigamy. So because of that, the Rabbeinu Gershom says that they had to, bend to the will of the local ruler, and they disallowed bigamy. But now, what the Yavitz means with this, and Hitaka almost says this explicitly, is the Yavitz would hold that there's nothing halachically or Jewishly wrong with marrying two wives. Even Rabbeinu Gershom never held that there's something wrong with halachically marrying two wives. Rabbeinu Gershom felt, in the circumstance that we find ourselves, it's not allowed, it can't be done. And because of that, he made a chayrim, and now the way charamas work is once there's a chayrim that sticks, and once communities take on certain isurim, they tend to have a lot of sticking power, and they don't just fade away on their own. Now, which we'll see, that whole shmuz mentioned last week already, if there's an expiration date to this takana. But that's the way takanas work, they don't fade away. But the subtext of Rabbi Yaakov Emden is that should Chachmei Yisrael, let's say by and large, you'd need, Rav Minyan, you'd need like a large group, should Chachmei Yisrael see a need to change their mind or feel like it would be better to change their mind, l'chayra they could change their mind, and l'chayra they could undo such exera. Meaning, if Lamashal, to solve the shidduch crisis, they thought that it's time for everyone to marry two wives, and the two salaries is better than one, the Glad can learn and Kail better, so be it. If the Gedalim decided that would be according to Rabbi Yaakov Emden is saying, it's not an inherent halachic position that the Rambam was taking. It's just it's a technical, circumstantial thing that happened. Now, eventually, Kehilas, stick with their manhagim, and it's very hard to peel them back. And exactly what Rav Minyan and Chachmei Yisrael would look like, it's hard enough to get the two people to agree to anything. So it's hard to imagine such a thing being peeled back. But meaning theoretically, according to Rabbi Yaakov Emden, it's something that could be peeled back. Now, the Chasam Sofer says that he's the only. This is a chiddush of his. The Chasam Sofer in Tshuva says he has a chiddush. He thinks that Rabbeinu Gershom made these takanas as a self-enforcing mechanism. Rabbeinu Gershom really was concerned with people divorcing their wives b'al karchai, because there were men who were just would disregard the needs of their wives, and if the wife would become too much of a pain in the neck, he would just divorce her. And a wife without a husband in the dark ages was a very difficult predicament to find yourself in. And Rabbeinu Gershom did not want men to be able to be abusive, so he made this rule: don't divorce wives b'al karchai. Now he realized shortly after, and according to the Chasam Sofer, this was like a 1-2 situation. It wasn't like he made these all in one shot. Rabbeinu Gershom looked around, he surveyed the scene, and he said, okay, 1 second, this helps. That doesn't really help, because a guy could just marry a second wife, and just without ever divorcing her, just jetson her without divorcing her. Just stop, just ignore her. That's like, goodbye. What are you going to do to me? I'm married to someone else now. So in order to enforce Takana 1, he made an enforcement structure, and he made Takana B. This is what the Chasam Sofer says. Again, according to the Chasam Sofer, there's not an inherent halachically wrong thing with marrying two wives. It's more of some sort of situational thing, and in order to enforce it and make it stick, Rabbeinu Gershom had to add a second layer. Now, there's many, many more time that I give, and I want to just cycle through a few of them quickly here. There's a tshuva here that brings them down nice and short. Let me just here. So we'll go through just a few of the reasons over here. So one of the first ones, if we're going in order chronologically, is the Chuvas Rashba. The Chuvas Rashba, he writes as follows: that he says V'hadeya noite shalei gazer b'chol anashim b'chol megurashim. Rabbeinu Tam didn't make this. The Rabbeinu Gershom didn't make this gzeira for all women and all megurashim. Shalei ratza ligzer b'nei pritzim v'amalim and shesem shalei karoi. He wanted to hold back people who mistreat their wives. He says he didn't mean this to be spread as wide as it's spread now. He didn't mean it dafka to include every single woman in Klal Yisrael. He meant to avoid a certain abuse pattern that he noticed. Now, what the Rashba is actually doing with this tshuva, and this is something that I think we'll discuss, down the line. The Rashba is really giving you some of the carve out, so to speak, of where this thing would not be negayah. Meaning, the Rashba is writing to Sfardim in Spain, and the Rashba is writing that Rabbeinu Gershom made a takana, but he didn't. It's not a. Meaning, he's good for saying this. It's not a halachic thing like it's asar on everybody. Rabbeinu Gershom wasn't saying it's a chiddush and din that from the Gemara and Yivamis that turns out this is asar. Rabbeinu Gershom was saying something practical, something technical, and Mamela, it's not negayah everywhere. Tam number 2 that's brought down. This comes from Chuvas Haran, the Ran and Chuv Memches, and the Mordechai says this also is the ikar takana was mishum ktata. If you bring a second woman into your household, it makes fights. He says look at Chazal, look at the Gemaras, fakert by Eidas Isha where Chazal is super makel, right, for someone to be made on a husband's death by agunis. We have all sorts of kulas, but one who's not trusted is a tzara. A co-wife is not trusted. Because co-wives hate each other. And it makes ktata and mela, in order to avoid fighting, this is what the takana was. Again, the Ran says this. Now, again, the Ran is going to hold that this is not for everybody, not for every time, not for every place. Most of these shittas that are giving rationales are going to hold that it's a specific technical thing. Now, ktata, I don't know if anyone's midas got better since the Dark Ages, so maybe ktata still applies equally. I have no idea how to rate that b'chlal. Like if the Ran saying this from ktata, like it doesn't go with the household structure, so it's hard to know. The third reason, and this is the first one from the Ram Padua, he says like Tikkun Rabbeinu Gershom Chayrim Minasuin Elam Mishum Chayrim the Gershon. So he's actually saying similar to what the Sefer is saying. It's different than a nuance, and I don't want to get into it. Then he brings the Yeshayimrim, a second one that says it's a Chash Mishum Mezaynas Isha, meaning very simply people did not have a lot of money back then. It was a very very hard time to make a living, and he says Rabbeinu Gershom was chayshish that a guy, and this is taka a good psychological analysis of people. He says a young guy. He goes to work, he's being successful, he's making a few dollars, he feels like he's on top of the world. He marries one wife, he takes in a second wife, a third wife. He's got this on lockdown. And then, the downturn comes, and he's not really as high and mighty as he thought he was, and things are not exactly how he thought they were. And now he's stuck with 2, 3, maybe 4 wives over there. He can't feed them. They have children already. What's supposed to mean? In order to avoid, this is what Pater brings us, in order to avoid, this is a hedge against the downturn in the economy. And a guy marries wives when he's young and he thinks he's doing amazing. What happens if things don't stay as amazing as you think? In order to hedge against a downturn, Rabbeinu Gershom was misaken not to marry so many wives. A fifth reason, and this one we said this is the Shelos Yavitz, is because of the sakon of the Goyim that we mentioned. A sixth one that's brought down Hashem the Shemin Sasan, the Tshuva of the Shemin Sasan. This is an interesting one. He says we've spoken about this Gemara in the past. There's a Gemara in the end of Cheskes Habatlim that says that after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, Be'etzem Chazal held that we should stop having children. Because the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, we shouldn't have children, it's something we should stop doing. But Chazal saw that people wouldn't be able to be oimid in that, so Mela, they didn't make such a takana. So he says Rabbeinu Gershom, and this is a Psachidish, 1,000 years after the Churban fell, this is the Zeichel Churban that we can handle. And just like we break a glass by the chuppah and we leave a square unpainted, not taking a second wife is the Zeichel Churban. Now, some of these reasons associate each other, because according to the other ones, maybe the Zeichel Churban would be to take a second wife. You have to, if it's ktata. So some of these reasons are a little bit hard and sassy, but this is what the tshuva in the Shemin Sas. Now, a seventh reason that's brought down, the Mishkan Yaakov in a long tshuva about this, is a practical shash. He says, we don't want Gzeir Shem Yisa, ach v'achis. We don't want a brother and sister getting married. He said, in those days, communication was very shvach. A person could marry a wife over here. He goes away for business. He spends months, years, wherever this far-flung location. He decides to marry a second wife over there. Wife one, Lav Dafka knows about wife two, even if the wives know about each other, but the kids don't know each other. You can end up having a brother and a sister who marry each other, and it's just not a thing. Now, because of that, some place can say, and the Mishkan Yaakov himself addresses this, is that Bizman Hazeh, and he's talking in his time, it's like Chavachayim in our time, when things are much more known and common, it's harder for this type of mix-up to happen. This is a handful, and there's really more. This is 6, 7, 8 reasons that are given for the Chayim of Rabbeinu Gershom. Now, what's interesting, and I think we point this out many times already, is that if you look at the subtext of a lot of these reasons, most of them are not saying like a halachic gzeira, meaning a normal gzeira is there's your chash of an isser. Some of them are, like Lamashal Shem Yisa, brother and sister might marry each other. That's a regular lemigdar milsa. That's a takana, right? But some of these things are practical. They're situational. They're not exactly for everybody. Now, Memela, this opens the door to Charamas Rabbeinu Gershom not being for every single person. Now we know that Rabbeinu Gershom's takanas. It's a little bit hard for us to analyze this like objectively because we already know the answer. We know that Rabbeinu Gershom's takanas took root tremendously in the Ashkenazi Kehillah, and that means everybody that followed from them. The Germans, the Polish, the Litvish, the Russians. Everybody there comes from Ashkenaz, the French, everyone in the whole Western world. But we also know the Mitzacheni, the Spanish, and from there dispersed to Turkey and Greece and Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco and Iraq and Iran and Syria and V'chulu. All of those, Svardim, part of the Edot Mizrach call it, not all of them in that exact order, did not really accept this takana and were able to marry multiple wives. Now, the question becomes in the place when this is an interesting child. What about an Ashkenazi man with Sephardi wives or a Sephardi man with Ashkenazi wives? Like, how does this takana stick? Does it stick on a kehila? Does it like a kafta degarva? Does it stick on individuals? This is like some of the interesting childless. Now, there is I think we'll save for next week the Sephardim and Ashkenazim because it's a big discussion. It has a lot to do with modern halacha. But I just want to highlight this one. We mentioned this last week that there's poskim that seem to say that the takana of Rabbeinu Gershom expires at the Elef Hashishi. It expired shortly after Rabbeinu Gershom made it. 200 years after Rabbeinu Gershom made it. Now, the Chassam Sofer in a tshuva in Even Ezer and Siman Vav, he says it doesn't make any difference if the takana expired and what we have now is a minig from all the Gedel. It's all the same. It has the same chaymer, is what the Chassam Sofer says. Now, but Yich Shia, I just want to point out that this is not a day Yechidah. I just want to show you this. The Ramah in Even Ezer and Siman Aleph and Siman Yud, it goes as follows. I want to read you the Mechaber and then I'll just show you the Ramah. The Mechaber says as follows: Rabbeinu Gershom hichram al anoisa al ishtoi al bivam al hichram v'chein ba'arusa. Zak the Ramah Hagah. Imein writes to lichnes el lifter. Fine. Who the b'chamak b'sheish dicha el? And 1 second. Amram yesh chalkim v'sfir lei. There are those who are chaylik and hold. The chayrim the Rabbeinu Gershom noyeg afilu b'makom etzah afilu b'makom yibam v'tzarach lachlitz. Okay. Makom shein rishon. 1 second. I won't hear. I'm sorry. 1 second. The Mechaber says. Which is time we know that that's true, that's a fact. Rabbeinu Gershom's takana was not pushed everywhere. Fine. V'loi hichram, says the Mechaber, ella ad seifa ela fachamishi. He was only hichram, it's the Mechaber. The Mechaber says, and the Ramah doesn't disagree. Zakta Ramah hagla, Mikol makam b'chol medina seilu atakana v'aminig b'mkayim b'mayimid v'ein noisim beis nashim v'kayim b'trumas. Now, the Ramah doesn't argue. The Ramah doesn't say, no, the takana was forever. The Ramah just says, lo mishaneh, if the takana was forever, it wasn't forever, it's reinstituted, and this is the minig. Minig also has major teeth, and you can't follow the minig. So the Mechaber brings down this day, and the Ramah brings down the day. Now the Ramah, if you look in the Darkei Moshe, in the Torah, the Ramah brings down the makar of this day is really a marik that's quoting a Rashba. The marik is quoting a variant of the Chuvas Rashba. It's not the Chuvas Rashba that's printed in the Chuvas Rashba, but it's a variant that the marik has, and in that variant, the Rashba and the Chuvah says that this takana was only until Elef Hashishi, and the takana itself is weakened. The Rashba uses that as like a sniff to say that the takana doesn't apply. Now, many of the Gedolei Poskim from the Achronim jump on this Mechaber and the Ramah and they say it's just a day Yechidah. Why the Mechaber and the Ramah paskin like this day Yechidah? Meaning it's just a day, like this is not the day of Rav Yishayim, meaning the Rabbi Rubenberg has Chuvas about it. Rabbeinu Tam has Chuvas about it. Taisus brings it down in a few places. The Ravia brings it down in a few places. Not one of them says anything about the Elef Hashishi. These are the Gedolei Yishayim who lived and operated in Rabbeinu Gershom's, loose orbit, later obviously, but in the orbit of Rabbeinu Gershom, they would have had intimate knowledge of the workings of Rabbeinu Gershom's charamas, takanas. They lived in communities that lived and died by these charamas, and they don't mention a whisper about the expiration date of takana. So we have like Yarchik Edusa, you have a Rashba who's living in Spain, in a variant that the Marik brings, he said it. So why does the Ramah and but Yichshi, with all the tightness and with all the rayas fakir, the Ramah and the Mechaber do bring down that day that at the Elef Shishi it's bottled. So that's like an important sniff. Anytime we're going to look, and there's many shadows. One of the most common shadows is, let's say a person's wife goes crazy. What is he supposed to do? What's the eitzah there? Or a person's wife gets sick, debilitatingly sick, or whatever. Meaning, there's like a lot of shadows. So hundreds of chuvas about the shilas. This is always a sniff. So meaning, I just don't want to be malamayim for the fact that this is an important underlying principle. Now, one of the main shilas that gets discussed, and this is the more modern halacha element of it, is when two communities, are meeting each other for the first time after a long time of separation. So they have lots of different minhagim from each other, primarily Sephardim and Ashkenazim, and that melting pot happened like in the 1950s in Eretz Yisrael, with great fanfare and fireworks. And one of the main shilas that were negeya to this, melting pot of these two communities was in Yana Ishis like this. I think in Mitzvah next week we'll continue on There's a lot of the Rabbanut made a takana. Rav Adi had a strong position against it. We'll talk about that. There's a lot to talk about. Okay, to be continued.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.